So I have a question. What would it look like to take all the pain in your life, every time that you've been wronged or wounded, and make it into a song about how you're still here? A song about how you made it through. A song of survival. Or what would it look like to bundle up all the pain in your family? It would be the same thing. Or all the pain contained in the city of Vancouver. Or all the pain of the people who might share a common minority identity with you. Race, sexuality, something like that. And spin all of that into a shared song of survival. Would it be a loud protest song, or would it have more of a quiet strength? Would it be a punk song? A blues song? Maybe disco? Oh no, not I will survive, work my own, as long as I know how to love, I know I'll stay alive. I got all my life to live, and I got all my love to give, and I'll survive. I will survive. Just heads up, I'm going to sing a little bit this time. So don't leave me hanging. If you know the song, sing along, and I'll just cut us off so nobody gets embarrassed. So at very least today, if you fall asleep during my talking, you'll at least have some songs of survival in your head at the end. Turns out there's a lot of these songs, actually. I asked my Facebook friends to help me come up with songs of survival, and they came up with about 75. And then Denise found even more, and she put a bunch of them in a playlist that we'll play while we're having a meal together, so you can listen to those. But here in the bulletin, we have a very ancient song of survival, 3,000-year-old call and response song. And I would invite us to sing it, but I don't know the tune. So I'm going to do the second best thing and read it. So I will read the parts that are unbolded, and you can read the parts that are bolded. This is a song of ascent, so just heads up for anyone who's new. We've been talking through some psalms that the Israelites sang as they made their pilgrimages to Zion, to Jerusalem. So let's pray Psalm 129. They have greatly oppressed me from my youth. Let Israel say.
They have greatly oppressed me from my youth, but they have not gained the victory over me.
Plowmen have plowed my back and made their furrows long.
But the Lord is righteous. He has cut me free from the cords of the wicked.
May all who hate Zion be turned back in shame.
May they be like grass on the roof, which withers before it can grow.
A reaper cannot fill his hands with it, nor one who gathers fill his arms.
May those who pass by not say to them, the blessing of the Lord be on you. We bless you in the name of the Lord.
The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
This is not a rhetorical question. You can answer this. How did it feel to read that psalm? Just an
It's not how I think.
It's not how you think. It doesn't reflect your own thoughts. Yeah. That second half is kind of a doozy, okay? We're going to get to that part, but let's begin at the beginning and thinking about this. So verse 1, our songwriter starts with some good old-fashioned repetition, which is good for lots of songs. They have greatly oppressed me from my youth. It's hard to communicate the weight of a lifetime of oppression with one single voice. So all of Israel is called to join in, echoing that generational pain. They have greatly oppressed me from my youth. Thank you. Call and response is good. Have you ever seen a group of survivors sing together, with each person having endured a similar kind of pain? Can anyone think of examples of that? A choir like that? The one I thought of, I was watching the Grammys last year, and Kesha, is anyone a Kesha fan here? Kesha sang a song of survival. It's called Praying, and it's about being abused by her former producer. And she was joined on stage by hundreds of other female survivors of abuse. And watching it, I was just kind of overwhelmed with the power of their solidarity. The shared defiance, I'm still here, I'm not going to be silent. If we look at the psalm, it's kind of like, they have not gained the victory over me. But I was also kind of overwhelmed by just the depth and prevalence of the suffering. The sheer numbers up there. It's no longer just me, it's me too, right? One story of suffering linked to so many others. And sometimes words like suffering and oppression, they get too abstract. They kind of slip past our ears too easily. So songwriters need to turn to more vivid images to grab us. So looking back to verse 3, we find this image back. I think he's saying my whole life it's like I'm face down on the ground, and there's these enemies that are herding oxen back and forth over it, dragging a steel plow, and it's gouging my back. Back and forth, tearing deep furrows through my flesh. It's a horrific image, really. And it's reminiscent of whipping and slavery. So I think it's part of this psalm, part of the generational trauma is this enslavement. And just as that plow picture is kind of searing itself into our minds and our backs, we hear that sacred word, but. I'm not going to sing any songs about butts, just in case you're wondering. But,
even if we ask.
Even if you ask, that's not my type. But is the hinge of the whole song. It's the linchpin of almost every song of survival. I'm effed up, homie, you effed up, but if God's got us, then we gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. Do you hear me? Do you feel me? We gon' be alright. But is the key word. In the psalm here, we have two buts, and the first is dependent on the second. But they have not gained the victory over me, and but the Lord is righteous. So the enemies haven't gained the victory because God has righteously intervened. In some of the songs that we hear on the radio, the but comes when people discover their own inner strength, but in the Psalms it's entirely dependent on God. But the Lord is righteous, but the Lord is tzedek. And tzedek refers to an objective standard of rightness. So in the Bible, accurate weights and scales are tzedek scales. And when it comes to tzedek behavior and relationships, God is the standard. And the proof of this, according to the Old Testament, is the way that God stands with the oppressed to restore right relationship, like rebalancing the scales. So defending the widows, the orphans, and the refugees. And this God intervenes before the pain becomes defeat. God cuts the cords of the wicked. And I found that really interesting. It's back to the plow image. So God is severing the tie between the oxen and the plow. So the enemies are still like driving the oxen on, and they don't know that the plow has been cut off and it's not working. It's just sitting back here. So they're just wasting their time. And modern songs, we've already sung one today, talk about being bulletproof. So I'm thinking this is the ancient equivalent to being bulletproof, having the plow cut off. And their attempts to harm us have zero impact at that point because of God's righteous intervention. But that doesn't mean there aren't still open wounds and lingering scars, which brings us to the most troublesome second stanza of our survival song, into the wonderful world of imprecatory psalms. And that word just means cursing psalms, psalms that call down divine judgment on enemies. So there's about 36 psalms out of a total 150 that have parts like this. And this one we're reading is actually relatively tame compared to some. The curses we see here, if you look at verses 5 to 8, are against those who hate Zion. And the writer calls for them to be turned backward, to be put to shame, to shrivel up before they can grow, and to be denied blessing. There's a lovely harvest theme here, which is kind of nice for the fall kickoff. If you look at verse 6, that part about grass on the roof. In ancient Israel, the roofs were all flat, so there'd be a thin layer of soil, and grass seeds would blow up there, sprout up quickly, but wither because they didn't have root. And the idea of trying to harvest that grass into sheaves like wheat would have been just laughable if someone had sung this song. And then there's a harvest blessing. Verse 8, that last part, is actually a blessing that you would give at harvest. You find it in the book of Ruth, actually, when Boaz is greeting the workers in the field. It's that same blessing. So that's the blessing you're not allowed to give, is the harvest blessing. So basically, we're cursing our enemies with shame and unproductiveness. It's basically like, God, they plowed up the fields of my back, but let them harvest nothing. Don't let their plans come to fruition. And again, it's not nearly as bad as, say, the infamous Psalm 137, which begins, by the rivers of Babylon. Anyone know this one? There we sat down. That's it. And it ends with, it begins with that, it ends with, happy is the one who seizes Babylon's infants and dashes them against the rocks. Boniam did not include that part. I think we need to wrestle. What do we do with these passages? When we're dealing with our own songs of oppression, when when we're writing our songs of survival, should we include verses like this one? Christians over the centuries have had really different approaches to this, and I kind of delved deep into all of them this week. So I'm just going to briefly unpack 5 perspectives I've discovered and then close with a final thought of my own. So if you look on page 5, I've just got them listed there. So perspective 1, ignorance is bliss. It's more of a strategy than a perspective, but I include it because it's the approach taken in the lectionary. So if you're not familiar with the lectionary, it's a list of specific scriptures that are assigned each Sunday of the year, and they're used by several denominations to kind of refer to over the year. And that list only contains 5 imprecatory psalm passages. The other 31 are either left out or they omit the offending verses. So that's one option, just the ignorance. Perspective 2, keep cursing, it's God's will. So this is the approach of our friends at the Gospel Coalition, like John Piper and company. They say, just like an attack on David was an attack on God, same way an attack on Christians, any attack is now an attack on God. So we can justifiably pray these curses on anyone who opposes Christians. In fact, any true Christian who honors God's justice must pray for the downfall of God's enemies. And boy, is that a risky approach. It's assuming that we always share a common enemy with God, right? Assuming that we're automatically the good guys in the story. So when we read, they have greatly oppressed me from my youth, we're the me, not the they, right? We're not the oppressors. We're so quick to cast ourselves as the protagonists, as the righteous victims. And I think it's interesting that the ones who advocate this approach are among the most powerful and privileged people on earth. John Piper and friends probably have no awareness that with their complementarian, anti-gay teaching, they have greatly oppressed me from my youth. They've worked to oppose my preaching today. So as a variation on that, to try to fix this pitfall, we have to be or not to be, curse, but only from the margins. So this view says it matters who does the cursing and how much relative power they have. Cursing enemies is a way of speaking truth to power, calling on God to beat Tzedek, to restore right relationship by raising up the powerless and pulling the powerful off their thrones. I think that kind of works, but as long as the power relationship is obvious. So for example, when one country plants a flag in the other and steals their land, that's pretty obvious. But in situations where there's ongoing conflicts back and forth, it becomes a bit more difficult. Who's the oppressed? Who's the oppressor? Who shot first? Who started it? It's at least worth asking, though, in this psalm. We got, may all who hate Zion be turned back in shame. Why do they hate Zion? Is it because Zion did something to them a couple generations ago? Maybe they're just envious or greedy or cruel, but maybe they have as much reason to hate as we do. So this perspective 2b also awakens us to the danger of appropriating songs of survival as those who represent oppressors. So when a white person sings a civil rights protest song, as we're actually going to do at the end of the service, we shall not be moved, I think we need at least a bit of awareness that people who looked like me were the ones trying to force them to move. And we still benefit from a system that asks them to move. So it doesn't mean we can't join in the song, it just means we need that humility and that check to say, how are we working to undo the system that still oppresses? And sometimes we're asked to join in the song of the oppressed in solidarity. Won't you help to sing these songs of freedom is all I ever have. Redemption songs. Perspective 3. Redirect the curses. So this one was popularized by C.S. Lewis, actually. Instead of firing the curses at human beings, let's redirect them to these spiritual and systemic forces of evil. So instead of cursing those who hate Zion, we can curse racism or homophobia or Satan, if you prefer. I discovered a Namibian woman named Zephaniah Kamita who had reworked Psalm 137 for her context. And so for the part about smashing babies into rocks, she asks that the apartheid system be smashed on the rocks, cursing not the white politicians, but the system that they upheld. And I think this believe that the enemy is not flesh and blood. I think I talked about good guys earlier, but I don't think they actually exist. That good and evil, battleground is inside all of us. So by all means, let's rage against the spiritual powers, the principalities that so often incarnate as the corrupt systems of the world, and make it hard for the good to prevail in each one of us. I'm just skeptical that this strategy works as well as we think it will. Because it's basically the same thing as loving the sinner and hating or cursing the sin. And as someone who's been on the receiving end of that strategy, I see that some folks who try to love me and hate my homosexuality actually really struggle to do that because they're so filled with disgust from my so-called sin that psychologically they see it almost as a transferable contaminant, and it makes it hard to then want to embrace somebody who's contaminated. So I think cursing systems or evil forces doesn't get us as far away as we hope from cursing people. When we curse apartheid, we're still picturing the white politicians. And when we say F the police and mean the fallen police system, it's hard not to let it poison our heart toward the others, the officers. And one more thing, spiritualizing the oppressor in these Psalms risks covering over the reminders of the ways that we're literally oppressing people. So it can become very convenient to make this all about the spiritual powers and miss how we might be the plowmen that are plowing up people's backs. C.S. Lewis, living in colonial England, might miss important social implications of this psalm if he jumps to redirect the psalmist's anger to Satan. Perspective 4, curse so you don't do worse. I made that up myself. Thank you. I'd say this is the most common modern approach. We have a very therapeutic culture, and as Walter Brueggemann says, when you're wronged, you must voice your rage. When we bottle up our anger or pretend that what happened wasn't really that bad, it usually ends up erupting later, and sometimes it's in retaliatory violence. So in this view, nonviolence requires a release valve. Miroslav Volf is one of my favorite writers, and he says that nonviolence requires a belief in divine judgment. People need confidence that God will avenge them, or else they'll take matters into their own hands. So you let out the rage, you submit every vengeful idea to God, and trust God to do the judging and the punishing instead of you. It ends the cycle of violence, and it helps you to be set free from that pain of your enemies. I break chains all by myself, won't let my freedom rot in hell. Hey, I'll keep it running because the winner don't quit on themselves. And I think that this honest venting approach has a lot of merit. I think God does welcome our brutal honesty. God doesn't ask us to put on a happy face and pretend it didn't happen. I just have these two little niggling worries about it. One, what does it do to our image of God to always imagine God carrying out our vengeful fantasies? Does it not place somewhat of an imagined divine stamp of approval on them, even if God never actually does those things, even if God shows mercy? And two, I worry about the therapeuticness, I don't know if that's a word, therapeuticness of communal cursing, like this psalm would be communal. And it's one thing when you vent your curses privately in your own journal or your songwriting, but what happens when you sing curses and then teach your kids to sing those curses and they teach their kids as they're walking on their pilgrimage, and suddenly the kids harbor grudges on their parents' behalf? These curses gain some kind of generational momentum instead of actually venting and releasing the pain. So I think words are really powerful. In ancient Israel, curses weren't just therapy, they could actually make bad things happen. That's how people thought. Curses were effective. So I don't want to underestimate the weight of our words, and I think words, especially some words, can actually be a type of action. Which brings us to our fun perspective. See the curses, don't ignore them, but choose to bless. And just because it's last doesn't mean it's best. This view says that curses are very human. Curses are real and honest. Don't ignore them. And God doesn't ignore them or edit them out of the Bible, but Jesus has shown us a different way. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And Paul says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. So this view says that maybe these Psalms need to be seen as an honest first step, but not one that we should revisit and copy. Rather that we grow up and move past it. Kind of like those parts where Jesus said, you've heard that it was said this, but I tell you this. When they go low, we go high. They skipped 2 psalms ahead to Psalm 139 and borrowed this verse. Let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our heart be acceptable in thy sight here tonight. So it's almost like they were saying, God, we know there's supposed to be a cursing part here, but we want you to take this rage that's simmering in us that we carry and transform it into whatever is pleasing and acceptable in your sight. Interesting. Actually, Kesha takes a similar approach. I referenced her already. In her survival song, she, instead of cursing, expresses a hope, however sincere, for the salvation of her horribly abusive producer. It goes like this. I hope you're somewhere praying, praying. I hope your soul is changing, changing. I hope you find your peace, falling on your knees, praying. So it's hard to say whether she's really turning the other cheek or trying to keep burning coals under her enemy's head, maybe both. I think the only tricky thing with this bless instead of curse view is that it's not as straightforward as the Old Testament curses, the New Testament blesses. The Old Testament also has plenty of stuff in it that calls for love and mercy. And the New Testament, Jesus Christ also rages in the streets, as we sang. Paul curses people. Scripture isn't steady, it's messy, and it's back and forth, so we can't be too cut and dry that way. This makes it challenging, but I think it also makes it real. So we got 5 perspectives, and none of them is perfect. I've named pros and cons to them, and I'm not going to give you the final word on cursing your enemies. You can ponder that, and we can keep the conversation going over dinner and church in the small next week. I'm just going to close with one final observation. If you look at this psalm in your Bible, and you look at the one right after it, number 130, it's a song of confession. The songwriter cries out from the depths and waits on God, like watchmen wait for the morning, waits on God to forgive. If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, who could stand? And the next one after that, Psalm 131, is about finding peace in God's presence, like a young child cuddling with its mother. So my thought is that we shouldn't cherry pick these songs or separate them out from the rest. The Pilgrims would have sung the curses in 129 and gone right on to the confession in 130 and the peace of 131. Righteous rage can move to a recognition that we have evil in us too, and waiting on God can move into peace with God. This songbook is really dynamic, it doesn't stay put. And I think that our songs of survival have to move like that too. As we process our pain and wrestle with evil and find hope, we need movement. We need lots of genres, we need lots of tempos, lots of keys. And we shouldn't dwell too long in any one place, whether it's cursing or waiting or resting. So again, I ask you, what would it look like to take all the pain in your life and weave it into a song of survival? In other words, how will you choose to tell the story of the pain in your life? How will you remember it? How will you talk about it to your kids or the people around you? What vivid images of plowmen or other things will you use to paint the picture of that oppression? Will you curse your enemies? Where will that turning point, that but, come in? Will God show up in the song as the one who abandoned you? I mean, Mark preached a couple weeks ago about how God will keep us from all harm. Or will God be the righteous one who came and cut the cords of oppression? Or both? Maybe it depends which chorus you're in. Or how honest you can dare to be. I think God can take it. No one should hold their pain on their own. Is this a song that you can invite us to sing with you? There's power in our words to heal and to curse. There's strength in solidarity to rise. So no matter what your song sounds like now, I pray that it moves, and I pray it leads you to that place of peace. And maybe it will carry some of the rest of us home with you.
we're going to actually, probably, I won't try and do it, but we're going to sing it together, Wait for the Lord Whose Day is Near. And that's really the tone.